Today with your host, Dale Wetzel.
This is Dale Wetzel. This is the Legislature Today radio program. We're coming to you from the Peacock Alley American Bar and Grill in downtown Bismarck, North Dakota. This second half hour is we're going to feature the gentleman from the Northwest Landowners Association. His name is Troy Coons. He's the vice chairman of the association. And the Northwest Landowners Association is involved in helping to resolve difficulties among landowners and primarily the oil industry about land use and practices that are brought on by the oil development in northwestern and western North Dakota. We also have with us Representative Dick Anderson, a Republican from Willow City, whose district includes part of northwestern North Dakota. And we also have with us Mr. Bob Bam. He's the owner of Ag Soil Science Research and Consulting in Minot, and he has some things to say about the effects on the soil of energy development in northwestern North Dakota. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dale.
Mr. Bam, when you have oil development in a place, you have such things as a reserve pit that's dug for dumping of liquids and things, and you just have a number of things that can affect the soil and its productivity. Could you tell us about what some of those things are?
Yeah, anytime you have any excavation taking place and you start moving soil, you have a potential to change the groundwater flow and things like that. And we've done some work with municipalities on this with lagoons and things, and we see saline areas probably sometimes start to show up, 500 feet to 1,000 yards maybe out away from where some of this excavating was done. And so in our business, what we've done with some of our producers, farmers, landowners that have some sites, they're doing it on their own right now, is we're going in and doing some soil sampling. We've set up a protocol of where we take the samples, how far out we want to go, and that depends upon the lay of the land and drainage issues and things like that. But at least what we're doing is we're mainly looking at soluble salts that are in the soil and the pH of the soil. So if there is a problem down the road, they have a baseline to look at. Without doing that, if it shows up later, you have no idea where those numbers were before. And it's a cost to the landowner or the producer, and in a lot of cases, guys I work with, it's a cost to them, and they're not even getting the revenue from any of the production. They own the land, but they don't have any minerals. So they're getting hit on losing agricultural land that was in production with a one-time payment. And then potentially, if this happens, they have a problem where they lose more production. And I just think that there should be something in place within the industry to help compensate that producer for the potential if this does happen on his land.
So what the objective here is, if I'm understanding you correctly, is to find out where your soil, the condition of your soil before this development started, and that way you have a basis for comparison when you go back and test it later after the the development.
Because if you don't have that, how do you prove that there was anything that changed or whatever without those numbers?
How common is it for producers to seek this kind of data, sir?
Not very common right now. We just have a very few that I've talked to, and suggested to them, because there is a cost to it, for us to do this. And, like I said, we've kind of set up our own protocol, but maybe that's something that needs to be put into, that there's a standard through the industry of how this is done so that the things are done correctly if someone's going to do it.
Okay, Mr. Bam, if I'm going to hire you to do this for me, how much is it going to cost?
Well, it's going to depend upon how big of an area we sample. If we start at the site and we do a set of samples right at the site, and then we go out 50 yards and do another set of samples, and then 100 yards, 500 yards. The more samples we do, it's going to get costlier. You're probably looking at a minimum, though, of 250 to 500 a site, and then up from there.
And how big is a site normally?
Well, it would be around the perimeter around that well development site, you know.
How are you able to, do you think it's appropriate to do this if you have a situation where there may not be development on the land, but, you know, you're next to a dusty road and there's a lot of dust being kicked up and covering your pasture ground or your crop ground?
Well, I'm not so sure there. We do some work out in the Nesson Valley for some irrigators. We monitor their potatoes on a weekly basis. And if you go from 1804 down to where all the water depots are, you've got about 2 miles of gravel road that they try and keep watered. But like this last year, I would say minimum of 100 yards on either side of that county road, the crops were virtually dead because the dust collects on them. Sure, you've got the sprinkler maybe coming around to wash them off again, but the dust settles on the leaf and you have no photosynthesis taking place and the plant just eventually dies.
Could you tell us a bit about yourself? What's your background and how did you get into the soil science consulting business?
Well, I was born and raised at New Salem, and then I graduated from Fargo, and we started our business in 1982 in Minot. So we've been at it a while. And our main part of our business has been soil sampling and testing for farmers for fertility needs. And then we also do contract research work for chemical companies, fertilizer companies, seed companies, and that.
And what, when you do work, who do you usually do the work for? What sort of demand is there for your services and from whom?
Well, our customer base is all farmers. They are the ones that we work for. That's the majority of who we work for is producers in the state of North Dakota. Our trade area goes from the Canadian border north and down. We do work out in Belfield area, Scranton, out towards Williston. So we're doing a lot of work in this area of oil production too.
Mr. Coons, is there any legislation pending or contemplated that would encourage the sort of practices that Mr. Bam is talking about in terms of testing your soil before there's some oil development on it to make sure that you know what it was like before the oil development came?
We had a bill before the House, 1349 this session for reclamation, looking for a baseline like we were talking about, so you know your topsoils, your A, B, and C soils, your salts, all of that. That got voted down. We looked at then going to a study bill. That got voted down as well this session. So right at this point, no.
Mr. Anderson, Representative Anderson, what do you think about the idea of having some kind of requirement for, say, if I'm an oil company, I want to come onto your property and explore for oil, should I be required to pay for some soil testing to make sure that when I leave that the soil will be in the same shape in which I found it?
Well, you hope that the soil's in the same shape as when they first arrived, but I've done some variable rate fertilizer on my farm, and we use satellite photos with UV pictures, and you probably know about that, Bob. You can actually see where the bad spots are in your field and what's lacking. You can even see the dust that slides off the road onto your fields, how it affects your crop. So you not only have to soil test, I think if you have UV pictures, basically what they are, of before the pre-drilling or whatever, before the oil company comes on your land and afterward, I think that can even be of some value. But I've farmed for years, and salt is a grave concern in our area, even though it's just from alkali and ground seep. But I guess I'm not opposed to that.
How much does it cost to get the sort of photographic data that you just mentioned?
It's $1 an acre, and we use it to program our implements, our seeders, for variable rate fertilizer. And those UV pictures show spray drift, or any time the crop struggles out in the field, you will get a different color tone on your map, and it's amazing what you see.
And what does that do for your yield and making you more efficient in terms of applying chemical?
Well, it basically works more with the fertilizer application. We'll soil test according to what we see on our maps, and we'll overlay the yield map on there. Plus, when we soil test, we'll try to test these different zones. And what it does is we basically cut our fertilizer expense, and our crops ripen more even, and the yield is more consistent. We do spend some money on the technology to use this application, but...
Does it pay off? Is it worth, this data all sounds really cool, but is it worth the expenditure that you make?
Certainly.
Yeah. Mr. Coons, to what extent can you carry this argument forward about the need for soil data on a test on an oil well exploration site, and the efficacy of having that, and whether it should be paid for, frankly, by the oil explorer company?
Well, what we're looking at doing now with the bills being voted down is the next step is this summer they're looking at putting some standards in administrative rule. So we're looking at working with them on that to kind of help them guide that, hopefully get standards that we're comfortable with and our membership are comfortable with, and work with people that are soil scientists that know this.
Who would be doing this? Which agency?
This would be the Oil and Gas.
The Industrial Commission?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Bam, do you see an increasing number of folks who see the need for this sort of data?
Well, I think there's the producers out there, that are having this development on their land are starting to see it, because they're starting with more wells going in. They start to see some of this. We've worked for years in the Glenburn area, which is an old oil field site, and there's massive areas in that area that are saline, that with no crop production in them. I don't think the industry does today what they did back then. I think there's better requirements in place for handling the salt water than there was in that old oil field. But, if you go to some of these older oil fields and see how much land has been lost, and I think that's what concerns these producers out here, is as more and more production comes in, the potential is there. Now, I also sit on the State Board of Ag Research and Extension at NDSU, and the last session we were very lucky. It was something kind of a pet project of mine. We got good funding for the soils department, and we've got an NDSU is doing quite a bit of work in saline work. The USDA Research Center in Mandan's got a lot of data on saline. So I think there's a lot of this information that's out there that can be utilized by producers, consultants, the industry, to help alleviate some of the potential problems.
And what can be, in your ideal world, what could be done to ameliorate the problem of soils becoming increasingly saline?
Well, there's going to be all different kinds. Just in crop production areas, one of the things that can be done is tiling to move that water away. Because what it is it's groundwater that's moving under the soil, and it's taking the path of least resistance. So wherever it can come to the surface, it comes to the surface. As it comes to the surface, you have saline or salts in the soil, and it brings those to the surface, and the water evaporates, and then you have salt on the top. And once the salt gets to such a certain level, then crops won't even germinate in it. So then you start losing production. So
what happens when that happens to soil? Can you recondition the soil or fix it?
Well, you can, like I said, there's a couple different things. You have to get rid of the water for the first thing. There's deep-rooted crops. Some crops are more tolerant to salt, barley and sunflowers being one. If you can start to utilize that water, that's a pretty simple fix. Will it completely correct the problem if you have a big white saline area? No. If you can't get, because those are what we call kochia patches generally. The only thing that seems to thrive in them are kochia and stuff, because it can tolerate those high salts. The biggest thing is getting that water use out of the soil. So there's tiling, there's cropping rotation, different things like that that's being tried right now to bring this soil back into production.
Bob, do you mind if I ask you a question? I've been reading about energy beets. Supposedly they grow in saline soils. Well, have you heard anything about that?
They can to a point, unless, like I said, if the salt level is so high that you can't get them to germinate, then they're not going to grow. So it kind of gets to the point, if it gets that bad, then there's really nothing you can do except trying to extract that water, draining it away to bring the salts back down.
Energy beets, are they used to make ethanol, or what is their purpose?
It appears like it. And there is some test plots in the state, I think, where they are doing this. And they grow better in that ground than barley or sunflowers do, from what I understand.
Well, the biggest thing with a beet is the deep taproot, that you're going to utilize water to a deeper level to help utilize that. Some of the farmers that we work with, the biggest thing we found is the more growth you can have on those areas, that helps anything that you can have growing out there to use that water as it's coming to the surface. So some guys will get done with their crop and they'll go in and harvest their wheat and then seed something else into it just to get it. A real prime area that's really bad in saline is real close to here. Just go south of Amanda and to St. Anthony. There's terrible saline areas out there. You get out in southwest North Dakota, there's been problems. The Red River Valley from north to south has saline areas in it. So it's a statewide program, and that's why I think a session ago they saw the need for it.
And what has been the result of that? You mentioned some research money that was obtained on this subject, and what happened with that?
Well, what they've done, like for NDSU, what the legislature did 2 years ago to fund the soils initiative that was brought forward through SBARE, I think they hired 11 additional people to work in the soils department across the state. Some of them are tied in with extension, some are actually researchers, and they're all working together to, like there's Chris Augustine in Minot is done a lot of work in saline. There's a new fella in Langdon that's doing. All these people came on at one time, and so they're doing it, working together across the state to try and get as much information out to producers to help alleviate this saline problem.
And to what extent is the saline problem a naturally occurring problem, and to what extent is it exacerbated by oil development in western North Dakota?
It's always been here. Wet years seem to have a tendency to bring it on more when your water table gets higher. And the water table changes from spring to fall. Like in the spring now, or in the summer too, you'll start to see the water table will push to the surface, and then by fall it goes back down. So it's always been here. It's just when we've came through some of these wet years, it's probably worse. And like I said in the very beginning, anytime you do some type of excavating, you have the potential to disturb the natural flow and percolation of that soil. And so if it was coming out, or if there was an area where free water could move, and you build this oil site on it, it's going to go somewhere else.
One of the things that I wanted to explore with you a bit is you have situations in western North Dakota on oil sites where you have reserve pits dug and stuff dumped into these pits, and then eventually what happens is, as I understand the practice, they just covered up with dirt and left. And what is that a prudent way to handle reclamation of a reserve pit, and if not, what's a better way?
Well, and that's not an area that that I deal in a lot, but I would think that you've got to have some type of a material to contain it within that, and then from there, when they abandon these sites, when they get done, there's got to be a way to make sure that this doesn't cause problems down the road.
Because I'm just wondering if you can grow anything on top of a reserve pit once it's covered with dirt and kind of left to settle.
The only thing there would be is it would be like reclamation, in the coal mines too. We've got a great system in the state for that, and I think that's partially where, whether it be NDSU or the state, the Industrial Commission, those are things that, with this rapid expansion in state, that needs to be looked at.
Mr. Coons and Representative Anderson, do you have any thoughts on how to deal with reserve pits that are no longer being used?
You know, I think they cover the area with fly ash and try to put a barrier to seal that solution in there so it doesn't leak out. And I don't know if it works all the time. Maybe they should have some test wells occasionally around those pits to make sure they're not leaking. But I do not think that you're ever going to be able to restore that land to as productive as it was. So I'm wondering if you shouldn't put, maybe if you could get some type of tree to grow there, at least it'd be some wildlife habitat or provide some use.
I guess myself, I know they mix the fly ash in, which kind of sets it up, and whatever containing system like these poly linings, they do have a life expectancy. They use the term forever, but nothing's really forever like that. And when we were talking earlier about the watershed, when you put a road in these sites, the water does move differently. It does change the structure of the land. That's where some of these things we were talking about on sites come into place, and it's not just the physical site itself. It expands outside of that. Earlier there we're talking 250,000 square miles would be taken, or 250 square miles, not 250,000, apologize. 250 square miles would be taken up by this, which equals 300,000 acres. Well, now it's more in the area of 400, 500,000 acres will be taken up by this. So the earlier we get something in place, in the end, this will be a lot better situation if we can have some standards to get this back to par.
And what do you see as if you're able to shape this yourself, what would you do?
Work with some specialists that, work with the salts and the soils, so you know that you're getting your topsoil back, your compaction rates, your salts, everything back to par, because you don't know what will be left on site. Those type of things. Guide the oil and gas, or next session if we come back with another bill to try to get reclamation, because we're drilling a couple thousand wells a year. This is changing fast. It's time to get out ahead of it.
Dale, and I talked to Troy about this, but when the potash is eventually developed in the state, we're going to have to deal with salt there too. So we need to get a policy in place to be able to deal with salt damage all over, because the potash, a byproduct of that, is chloride. So
yep.
We need to do something.
We're looking at, trying to do more education, get out there, educate people, and until we get something in place, educate people that they can do something privately with these sites as it's going along. So a lot more education.
Mr. Bam, you probably weren't coming here expecting to get this question, but what is your impression of the legislature and the work it's done, just observing from afar?
Well, I was a little disappointed. I happened to be in Belfield on Saturday. Met that evening with a couple producers that I'm glad they were in Belfield and not Bismarck when they saw that $400 million was pulled for western North Dakota.
Yeah. Yeah.
I live in Minot. My wife is from Ray. She was raised there. So they've been in oil country there as she grew up. My father-in-law still lives out there. And it's changed so much. Troy and I were talking, I can't go out and just on a Sunday afternoon and drive down a township road anymore and shoot a bird or a duck or anything. You might get run over. When we're soil sampling, like out at Belfield, you can't even, we use pickups to soil sample, and some of these roads are impassable.
We've been speaking to Mr. Bob Bam. He's the owner of Ag Soil Science Research and Consulting of Minot. We also have been talking to Representative Dick Anderson, a Republican from Willow City, and Troy Coons, the Vice Chairman of the Northwest Landowners Association.
The Legislature Today is brought to you in part by Prairie